Man, I am struggling right now because I am working on a big project, a project that was already due, but I am behind on it. Black History Month, presentation creation on the job, three big old boards that we have to decorate, and what we're going to do on there for a tribute. My era is 1900 to 1929 ish. And so there's a lot that can be said for that era. So I got to start though with relieving my anxiety by at least showing some of this information that I've been privileged to uncover or recover. A lot of it really was known, but the part of it that is actually new to me, I wanted to share. So, of course, the preeminent leader from like 1890 to 1915 when he died was Booker T. Washington. So to bring that out as a pioneer in STEM. So the overall theme of the Black History Month program that we are creating is, the Black inventors and scientists and technology, all of that. That's the focus. And I have three boards to actually make the presentation on. And that is a challenge because of all of the information that could be included in there. And so, where do you start? I'm going to bring up just a little bit of what I was doing is to show that progress. It's been a heck of a journey just trying to get this information together, but I'm going to talk about it. So the very top strip, you see the timeline. It has to be cut out and put on a billboard. So you got to make the font size huge. Purpose statement, the development of industrial Black men. That's fair enough for Booker T. Washington, as he was a man who advocated for skills and entrepreneurship. All right, Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee Institute. So that's going to be pretty big there on the size board. It's by probably like 36 by 48 are the sizes of the boards. And so you got to get a big picture. Now, this one hurt my ink. So it hurt my pocketbook. Like I was just watching the ink drain trying to print this one. I could have took it to Kinko's, but short on time. As I was saying, it was due a couple of days ago now. The Tuskegee University College of Veterinary Medicine does have their annual symposium on March 18th. So I wanted to make sure that this information tied into today and why that's important. Company I work for, we do the financing for veterinary practices. So you got to have a big placard, keep the information simple. You know what I'm saying? Very simple, streamlined. Legacy, he was an organizer and he was a fundraiser, right? So he founded the college. It takes a bit of an organization, but his finding the college is also attributed to Adams. There were people already there. He graduated from an HBCU himself, Hampton in Virginia. The story of Booker T. Washington, of course, being relevant there, but let me go forward. He also used that entrepreneurial spirit to create that National Negro Business League. And so here's kind of how the presentation breaks down. I'm gonna have this top picture here, and then underneath it, it says his story. So when I cut it along this line, and cut all the white part off and just have the two Post-it notes, as you see the black on the left-hand side, that is the color of the board. And so that will be there. It will say his story as an organizer and fundraiser. And then I'm going to glue down the top one. And then the bottom one is open or a flap. All the other sizes of the little cards or the information cards will then be underneath his story. That way it's a very streamlined board. You have his big picture, you have his title card, his purpose statement, and then you have this picture and then his story underneath it. And then people who are walking through to look at the presentations or to view the board, they can lift it up and then see the information underneath. But it keeps it streamlined, so there's not a lot on the board, and I like it being simple. And then I had to go then with my knowledge of him and of the era and try to find information relevant that I can put inside of this storyboard. All right. And so these are the small size strips that insert, I cut them out and cut the white off. And then I put these in like a little flip pad underneath that top one. And so as you see it there, born into slavery sometime in 1856, Booker T grew up in Virginia during the Reconstruction era. And then more information is underneath that one as well, because as you're flipping, you can see that there's even more information that they can find. So I can get 2 or 3 stacks like this with more information underneath that people can flip through if they really want to continue reading the story. Now, the thing that gave me the most anxiety for this project is the idea that people will not want all of this information, which is why I had to try to find a process that streamlined the information for those who actually do. See, we don't focus on those who don't. We have to focus on those who do, which makes my job here of getting this information in a consolidated format and a streamlined version of the information on a clean board. It makes it worthwhile, right? Because there may be that 1 or 2 who actually do want this information to learn the backstory of the person. Others would just want that big placard that I created in the beginning that says founder of Tuskegee University. And then they would, probably want a couple of big takeaways, Virginia, the Tuskegee University College of Veterinary Medicine. That one is relevant to them, so they can say that and say, oh, and make the correlation quickly and move on to the next board. But I digress. It gave me a lot of anxiety because even though I know it's not for those who don't want this information, it still gave me that sense of, damn, I could do all of this work on this presentation and be meticulous with it, and motherfuckers will still just walk by and look at the pictures. It also gave me some anxiety because it's like, damn, some people should already know this information. We're continuing to regurgitate the same information in order to get to the uncommon knowledge. When you really want to get to the storyline, you really don't want all of these talking points. You want to be able to speak it. But for a presentation where people only have about 15 minutes on their break, at the most, it took about 5 minutes to get there and 3 minutes to get back to their seat, to get back on those phones, call center style environment. When they only had 15 minutes, they had to be very selective of where they spent their time and would they spend their time reading the presentation if it didn't have the aesthetic appeal, i.e. those Black women who accentuate, and they put on the hair and they put on the eyelashes and they put on the makeup and the lipstick and they do above and beyond to get acceptance from others. This presentation is the lady that's inviting them to learn more. All right. And this is about the man who actually originated this model of agricultural education for Black bodies at a time when education was not the highest priority for Black anything. And there were some serious struggles. So now you got to go into the story just a little bit, just so that they can understand it. So I talk about it, I'll just go down the left-hand side. In 1872, at 16 years old, he recognized the need to build an economic network to be a catalyst for change. He was motivated to get the education that he longed for. He had to walk 500 miles to reach Hampton Normal Agricultural Institute in Virginia. Along the way, he had to do odd jobs to support himself. Post-Reconstruction, or in 1881, after graduating, he became a teacher and went on to open Tuskegee in Alabama. You can also put as the principal that he was brought in by those folks. He was recruited, actually, because he was already working at the institute he graduated from. I mean, he went from Hampton to another one, but anyway, this is his story. And there's so much that you can put in there, but when you only really have a Post-it note to share it on, you got to make sure it's concise. And so the next one, as you keep going down, is his rise to prominence despite Jim Crow segregation laws. So you want to throw it in there that the knowledge is there. And for someone else, they know these tag words. You do want it to be a bit triggering so they know the information. They may have only studied that Jim Crow segregation laws existed. They may know about them, but the trigger here is that he was 16 and then he was 21. And this is still his young life developing despite Jim Crow segregation laws. Washington became a key proponent of African American businesses, trying to keep it relevant, right? There was so much more that he did, but you got to make it concise. You got to give him something by mobilizing a nationwide coalition of middle-class Blacks, church leaders, and white philanthropists and politicians. That was that picture that you saw with the white folks in it, as well as, the Black folks who are also in that picture. And you'll also find that to be helpful because it moves. His school expanded slowly because of the lack of funding for land grant colleges. See, that's the major premise. I've studied the 1862 Homestead Act and the administration, the legislation of Abraham Lincoln, and I've presented that information. So I know so much about that, and the confiscation of land, the railroads that were built, and there's so much that happened from 62 and that Civil Rights Bill of 64 that you would want to be able to have that conversation on. It just doesn't fit in a sticky note. And then essentially you're still only trying to talk about or get people to the point of understanding the significance of starting a school. So, however, he never lost focus on racial uplift by way of education and entrepreneurship. So even though there was Jim Crow, there was all of those different laws that were against him and against Black people in society in general, it was a hell of a feat for him to start a school. It created that access to education. And at the time, again, I'll tell you, I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but at the time, education, it was like less than 4 out of every 10 Black child even had access to practical education. Less than 4 out of 10. And that was from 6 to 13. From 13 up, it got less. And then even from like 17 to 21. And we know, it was, we know as the Black folks who work for a diverse company, we know the history of why that's important, but does it need to be stated? In 1896, Booker recruited the famous agricultural scientist, George Washington Carver. I wanted to bring that one in because most people, when you say Black history and you say Black inventors in the 1900s to the 1929, they would think George Washington Carver, the guy with the peanuts, but he was just on the faculty. See, Booker T. Washington was the principal and the dean. He was the founder of Tuskegee Institute. And the guy who he recruited was George Washington Carver. All right, so turn of the century, he did all of that fundraising and all of that stuff to get the school up off the ground. I knew I missed it, but there was a couple of more stickies that could have been put there. But in order to streamline it, like the question is, well, what did he actually do as an organizer and a fundraiser? And that's the one that didn't actually get there. So let me see. Washington became a key proponent of the African-American businesses by mobilizing a nationwide coalition of middle-class Blacks, church leaders, and white philanthropists and politicians. So the next one would be more details than a lot of people would want to know, but it is the successful bills that were mounted, like the Second Morrill Act of 1890. You would want to throw that in, like it has to be there. Like when you ask, well, what did he actually do? This coalition, why was it formed and what was the purpose of the coalition was the actual bill that they actually got passed. I mean, and that one was the one that actually secured funding for the land grant colleges, which were vastly underfunded. There's another sticky note that I have that actually shows like the rise and the founding of the historical Black colleges. I'm gonna put that on the timeline for the board. And so that information will be there. But even in somebody just reading this, I don't see them having time to read all of this and to see that timeline and make it make sense to everybody. And so I'm thinking that my second board be the timeline by itself. All right, so turn of the century. In 1900, Booker T. Washington established the National Negro Business League. So now he's up in New York. The Harlem Renaissance isn't quite there yet, but the creation of that Harlem Renaissance was the bringing together of those intellectuals, those who could get education. Give you another fact right here. I have it on a different sticky, but it says in like 1864, there were only 4 African Americans who had graduated or had that post higher education degree in general, period, at the time of the Civil War. I got a couple of new stickies to drop that in. Why is that important? Because he was the one who cultivated the teaching of teachers. And if this man had to walk 500 miles just to go to the school, just imagine how restricted access was to that education at the time. What did they say? Like the churches were the school, Sunday school, if anything, because most Black children were not being educated. And we know that number even goes all the way higher. I wanted to even bring out the sticky that shows what it is today, the stark contrast where it's like 85 to 95%. But you don't get there without this framework being established. And so he used that coalition, formally incorporated in 1901. His organization grew to 320 chapters by 1905, and then 600 chapters in 34 states by 1915, which is when he actually passed. And so that's the story, the information. You could also put the bullet note there. At 1900, he was designated or appointed as an advisor to President Theodore Roosevelt. He was the first African-American man outside of the servants to attend the White House or to be invited to the White House. All of that about Booker T. Washington, and how do you get that on there? So I got a couple of big stickies to drop on there. Like this is from the legacy part. So I have another board that's going to say legacy, or another section of the board that says legacy. And then you have the United Negro College Fund, which was started there by the next president after he had passed. Started there at Tuskegee. Some of those next level things like the Tuskegee Airmen Institute or the Tuskegee Airmen that were brought, what was it? The program was actually housed there on Tuskegee, and they know it from the highly decorated World War II combat veterans. So you can just put Tuskegee Airmen, they know what that is, the highly decorated World War II combat veterans. You could put that they're Black on there, but of course it's Black History Month. They should already understand that. And then the bottom one on the left, today, nearly 75% of Black veterinarians in America are Tuskegee graduates. That's the big one that makes it relevant for someone who works in a space that does the financing programs for veterinarian practices. And then on that bottom right, which is everything that had been said about him, he lifted the veil of ignorance from his people and pointed the way to progress through education and industry. See, these are the big sticky notes, the big items that you just put on the board to be the call outs. So you have his storyline, which is underneath these big or these bold headers, right, like this. And then if somebody wants to turn the page, they can learn a little bit more about him. I think I did a pretty good job capturing that. Still working on this page here, which is, I think, is the information. So the occupational distribution. This was in 1900s. And so as you see here, for Black men, 22.7% were farm labor, farmers, 34.8%. And so they, this was after they had been emancipated. And so they're working very small farms. And then private service and laborer. So his was about crafts, the shoe shining Black man and all of that. They would eventually have some opposition from W.E.B. Du Bois, which was so hard not to bring into this conversation. It just had to be about him. But as you see here, I'm thinking this is like the challenges, or whether it was up against, or the opportunity area. The opportunity area was, they were farm laborers for Black men. There was, I think I had one with the population. There was about 9 million of us in 1900. And so what do you do with that? 4.5 million African-American men are Black men, and they need jobs, or they need access to jobs, but you're still in a Jim Crow racially segregated society. And you have 22% that are farm laborers. So they're still working on the farm. And remember, the last bullet note was 90% in 1900, 90% of the Black community still resided in the agrarian South. So they were still Black farmers and Black farm laborers. That was almost 60% right there, as farm laborers or farmers. And so he was trying to diversify the industrialism of men through entrepreneurship, those other crafts. I said he is one of the pioneers of early STEM, or the outcomes therein that you would want through your STEM education. And then, as you see here, this is one of the pictures of his coalition. This one here of the African-American men at his institution. You even have George Washington Carver. Oh shit, I'm switching the page and not even switching it on the whole slideshow. Y'all didn't even see all that the whole time. This is what I was referring to. These are the sticky notes. Still working on that. In 1862, the number of institutions, and then the slow growth all the way to 1890 due to the lack of funding. The map shows the slow growth of the land grant college system from 1862 to 1890 due to the lack of funding. Securing funding, here was some of the legislation that was in there. The Second Morrill Act, as we saw in 1890, it increased funding by $1,000 per year. Then in 1906, the Adams Act increased funding $15,000 for that first start. And then the incremental of $1,000 per year again. 1907, the Nelson Amendment came in, and it doubled the appropriation to these land grant colleges, which HBCUs are. Agriculture and mechanics, A&M schools are. Veterinary medicine, those schools are. They're a part of the land, or many of those are a part of the land grant colleges system. And then finally in 1914, which would have been the last one that his network could advocate for, was the Smith-Lever Act, which created co-ops. And that was the thing that finally you have all of these teachers, but you need these teachers to actually go out inside of the community and form these cooperatives with local small farmers. And I think that was in hindsight, probably the expansion from it being Black farmers to all farmers, and just finding whichever other partnerships that you could, and then helping those folks who had the community gardens and things like that, or the cooperatives, come together and actually execute on some of these systems and methods that have been created by the Tuskegee Institute. Now, again, those systems and methods for crop rotation, that was George Washington Carver, the head of the agricultural department. His mandate was to research and develop those cash crops like that peanut. And everybody, when you give them this information, they, as of 1901, invited to the White House even. So what did he do with that power as the first Black power broker? Power broker. He was the first Black power broker. Census records about 9.8 million Blacks in 1910. 90% of us lived in the South. A story of George Washington Carver that I shared. Some more information. See, this is the political stuff. A lot of people don't want all of this. They want it omitted, but I'm going to share it here and then present the board as clean and as polished as possible without all of this information that I feel like, look, man, if somebody actually wanted it, they should know it. But here, this is my relief. This is my research anxiety relief. Between 1890 and 1915, Washington was the dominant leader in the African-American community and of the contemporary Black elite. In 1920, Carver delivered a speech to the New Peanut Growers Association of America. This organization was advocating that Congress pass a tariff law to protect the new American industry from imported crops. As a result of this speech, he testified before Congress in 1921, and the tariff was passed in 1922. In 1923, Carver was named as Speaker for the United States Commission on Interracial Cooperation, a post he held until 1933. And then finally, by 1938, largely due to Carver's influence, peanuts had grown to be a 200 million per year crop in the United States, and were the chief agricultural product grown in the state of Alabama, which is where Tuskegee was. That is the impact. But how do you get there, and how do you omit all of that? Do they just want me to put that, the 200 million, the peanut man, and then by 1938, peanuts had grown to be a $200 million per year crop in the United States? That is the only bullet that they would get, because they know of George Washington Carver, and they know, oh, the guy about the peanuts. That is about as much as they could take away. And then you give them a number like 200 million per year crop, and that's about as much as they have time for in a call center environment where all you have is sticky notes to go off of. Did HBCUs originate as STEM-based institutions, agricultural and mechanics? That is something that I would put on there just to stimulate thought. Not really sure about this one here. In 1790, we numbered around 760,000. In 1860, at the start of the Civil War, about 4.4 million of us. And in 1900, we numbered nearly 9 million. So that is the context of the period that we could present. I don't know if I'm gonna use that one though. The percent attending school. See, this was the major challenge. The table that you see on the right, ages 6 to 13, only 37.8% for the sons and 41.9% of the daughters. Remember, we're talking about those who were born free or those who were born enslaved in slavery. And what do you do with these Negroes? Because we're still in a Jim Crow segregated society, and many are still Black farmers and Black farm labor, even into the 1900s. And so the condition of the Black household in the 1900s was Black farmers and Black, the data suggests that the majority of Black men and Black women their sons and their daughters were farm laborers, working on that farm and looking for avenues into the private sector, to be or to provide service, to be an entrepreneur or to provide a service. To be an entrepreneur and to provide a service. And so you see, on the table on the right, all the way up to age 21, they were not in school. 6.8% were actually attending for the sons of those born in the Jim Crow South, or post, what is it, post Civil War. Even had one that showed the legislation just so they know that this is actual information. There were a couple of more in that legacy from 25 to 28 that were actually included. Increase of around 30 for home economics. As you know, that was a big driver for the women's school, which is why the story of Mary McLeod Bethune, or Bethune-Cookman, is also a significant one, and why they say the feminist argument, or what do we do for Black women who are also in the same scenario, fighting for political power and to be Black power brokers. As we know, she was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And so he was invited. He was Theodore Roosevelt, his advisor. He was the advisor to Theodore Roosevelt. And then later would come Mary, also a HBCU founder, who was an advisor to Franklin and his wife, Eleanor. And the politics of securing funding for those land grant schools. Now, keep in mind, these are just bills and acts of Congress. They were organizers and fundraisers. That was the primary bulk of what they did. It was an agricultural and mechanics school. So at this time, you know that they are producing fruits and vegetables to sell on the market and to distribute. And then, as you see here, Smith-Hughes Vocational Education Act was trying to open up their doors for more students, or to be able to send their teachers out into the community so that they could actually market. They were working in coalition with churches. So who are you providing food for? Those churches, which were the distribution hubs for, education at that time. Those churches being Sunday school, and those meals that needed to be provided. Now, this is direct and this is indirect. This is actual and this is potential. Some of those land grant colleges were not forming those networks or feeding the greater community. Some of them just did not. They were too under-resourced, even with getting that $1,000 a year increase. Then, as you see, it was an increase of $1,000. But even when they recruited, even when Booker T. Washington recruited George Washington Carver, it was for $125 a month. So that one teacher would have took nearly that entire operating budget that was awarded that next year. And so it was necessary to secure the funding. As you see, it grew to 78 colleges. That was huge. Needed that information. Oh yeah, gearing up, bro, Rob. What else? Let me give you a little bit more here about some of the things that I was hit with. So in this era, we know James Weldon Johnson, Lift Every Voice and Sing. That was another invention that came out. If you would ask me, that music or that intellectual property is just as good as a patent. Later in those years, we know electricity is starting to get out there due to the invention or the patent, the drafting of that patent by Lewis Howard Latimer, working with and for Thomas Edison and even competing against him in the beginning. So the light bulb, that was 1882 as well, the same year that Ida B. Wells was thrown off that damn train. And so they're getting electricity in the houses, not our houses. It's not that big yet, but up in places like New York, Philadelphia, or whatnot. But making its way down south is the light bulb as well. The map that I was considering putting on there, as you can see here, maybe you can see it, we can see it a lot cleaner here. I don't know. It gets a little bit bigger, but not by much. Yeah, they hating on the blow up. As we see here, the percentage of African American population living in the American South. Man, this is huge. What happened there? It starts off that first Great Migration. The second Great Migration comes after my time period. Remember, 1900s to 1929 is the era that I'm talking about. And it's hard to just include, you know what I'm saying, the end result. We had this inventor who did this. Essentially because at that time, this was still the primary driver for innovation. We were still in the South, agrarian. We were still on those farms. 6 out of 10, as we saw, of the black men, the women similar. And so what we were still using was this a variation of this tool here, which was the actual second patent for an African American. This was 1807, years before. We were still just planting cotton, planting corn, harvesting, picking, doing all of that shit every year. When it was time to harvest, you harvested. And you use these tools, of this very affordable at the time tool for the small farmer. George Washington Carver, then being also significant, was crop rotation and teaching them about soil, and that in these rows of cotton or of corn that you dug with this still invention. So every so often you got to switch it up. Excuse me. You got to switch up which seeds you're planting in those rows. So George Washington Carver, biological regeneration of the soil through the nitrogen cycle and crop rotation. An educator at Tuskegee University, sought to revitalize Southern soil that had been stripped by cotton, a nitrogen depleting crop. He developed a crop rotation method that alternated the cotton with legumes and peanuts, or like peanuts, that fixed nitrogen and other edible crops such as corn. This method increased the soil's productive capacity and also gave Southern farmers another crop to produce and sell besides cotton, thus diversifying the market. In addition to crop rotation, Dr. Carver promoted the practice of using compost to reintroduce nutrients, and add organic matter to the soil. I cannot read today. He showed that using compost for soil revitalization increased its productivity by 100-fold compared with previous common methods. Using compost to build soil is a critical practice in organic farming and gardening today. Everybody's like, oh, is that organic? That's what you'll hear them say today, but they don't know that this methodology, even the teaching of composting, was still African-American George Washington Carver at the same time, not just the peanut. And so that would be another big dot that I would add to the presentation there. And what's in it for them today? There were some later inventions that fall outside of the scope of my presentation. Definitely hope somebody brings out the transportation refrigeration system. Why? Because now that you have the ability to mass produce produce, you're going to have to be able to distribute it to further markets. And so the refrigeration system was something that actually helped when you now look, a lot of those crops, the corn and stuff, that became the stuff that fed those cows and those chickens and stuff. And so you had more meat, more protein and all of that other stuff. But the farm, what is it? The mechanized farm today is because of the advancement of education through that large grant college system, the one that lacked the funding in the very beginning, but an African American was leading the charge to securing that funding through the HBCU. Still a small niche, only about 100 of them today, but the USDA would not be the USDA had it not been for the invention of the African Americans and their pioneer leaders in education. And then this last one was the farming cooperative. So I think this was the one that set me on this journey, rather than just putting his picture up there and then 2 bullet notes that I already knew, wanting to provide even more storyline about this guy. I know they may not read it, They, just like many, won't listen to this entire stream in one sitting, but the farming cooperatives to be the concluding piece of evidence or of the research. Since the abolition of slavery in 1865, numerous farming cooperatives were established to increase opportunities, land ownership, agricultural education, and living conditions for Black farmers, despite the setback from systemic discrimination. So again, we're not just waiting for reparations. We're still doing stuff at the same time where we're not just waiting for legislation, but there are people and groups and networks and coalitions running in the background while we are organizing and fundraising. All right. Historical figures such as Booker T. Washington worked to offer agricultural education to Blacks under the Second Morrill Act of 1890. Again, historical figures such as Booker T. Washington worked to offer agricultural education to Blacks under the Second Morrill Act of 1890. So when they finally did cut the legislation, the funding, for those schools, now you have these networks, these churches that already have a pretty good base of people who attend the church in their congregation, members. The members of the church, the Black men, because it's still segregation, those Black men who are 6 out of 10 of them farmers or farm laborers who go to church, they got Sunday school, their children are educated in Sunday school just like they were, Bible study and all of that, that meeting space, that church and its network and its growing network. Remember, it was like 320 chapters, grew to like 600 by the time he was done. Chapters of the National Negro Business League. Right. And into the 60s, it changed its name to the National Business League. It really had its change after civil rights gains. They just dropped the Negro off of it and just kept it National Business League because it is a network organization, his organization and fundraising. Right. And that model and the education, and this is how you plant your crops and the teaching of them in their conglomerate to create farming cooperatives, something profitable. Industry through their labor. All right. So he also promoted self-sufficiency practices. So Black farmers did not have to rely on white landowners or the cotton market for income. How is he able to do that? Because he has someone here who's teaching them the rotation. In George Washington Carver, he's given them other crops that you can plant and make use of, like peanuts for peanut butter. But there were others like corn. Right? He had to teach the nation the true value of corn. Yes, it spread to the West and it got there, but in getting there, it was mostly because of the education, the how-to manuals that were produced by these scholars. Others such as Robert Lloyd Smith, who began the Black Farming Cooperative called the Farmers Improvement Society of Texas. See, it spread Florida, Alabama, all the way to Texas. They even have a picture of Booker T. Washington in New Orleans. But Black Farming Cooperative called the Farmers Improvement Society of Texas worked to benefit Black farmers in all aspects of life. During the Civil Rights Movement, many others, including activist Fannie Lou Hamer, religious figures, and political leaders, continued to seek better livelihoods for Blacks in agriculture. The work of these individuals has helped improve conditions for Black farmers in the United States. Tie this in with what we already know, which is when President Obama was in office and he awarded reparations for Black Virginia farmers, and you have a full storyline. Cool. So I still got to get this timeline together. Working on that. Wanted to go into this conversation. I think I've decided that I won't use the talented 10th, Du Bois, because it just throws a conversation. It throws a monkey wrench in it. It has to stay about him. because there's so much in it. Like when the NAACP came up and how they were able to help push the lines. See, up until this point, George, up until this point, Booker T. Washington was the prominent leader, and he got some challenge because it was like bootstraps, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So the others who were arguing against it, such as the Niagara movement and those folks, they had media and they had newspaper and journalism, so they can give you something to read, but they couldn't give you a place to work. And the NAACP was yet to produce all of its chapters yet, its structure. It still needed a model similar to coalition building that was done by the National Negro Business League to get 600 chapters. They didn't have that yet for the NAACP, but they did have a distribution means in newspapers and such, and that was about as much as they could afford to do, as well as selling those newspapers. So they were the talented 10th, but how were they actually contributing besides the entertainment columns? Reading and literacy, all of that, yeah, good, fine, and dandy, but most were not getting literate. As we saw, the number of educated was still so small. The schools that were there or the access to the education curriculum wasn't there. They were developing a system. And so they were about as educated as a choir member could be, or a deacon or a deaconess or an usher could be, as Booker T. Washington was ushering in this age of education. See, that's the difference. He was ushering in, he was the pioneer for African-American education. And essentially, I say it was STEM. And so it was the focus on the Black elite. So I did save this one on the bottom. We'll use that one. But make no mistake about it, throughout this entire period, the 3/5 perception of Blacks was still at work in society. I'm thinking maybe I don't need that one. It is going a bit on the race side, and somebody may read it and just be triggered. So I don't know. I don't know if I really want to trigger the race, or do I want to trigger the inspiration? So either or, what do they walk away with? The land grant college system, veterinary schools, that one has the impact that's more directly associated with something they should know. I don't know, like when they hear veterinarian schools, we know if we do the financing for the veterinary programs, then it's going to be important if 75% of those teachers are coming from Tuskegee Institute School of Veterinary Medicine, that, hey, for those Black teachers to have their access, they need their funding. Anyway. Yep, that was the map, the significance. Oh yeah, this is what I was going through. Got my timeline headers. Tried to put it in a contextual framework. The creation of the NAACP, see, that just got super big, and it wasn't really this same person. And so it was hard trying to streamline this information. There was so much there. I was thinking maybe I just get a lot of small icons with all of the members who had something to do in it, you know, Black pioneers, and just get their picture, put that on a timeline with like a line to it and just their picture. So even though I'm telling the story of Booker T. Washington, on the timeline, you can see that it included so many others. And most of this was about organizing and fundraising. So education was important, and even at the highest level, but it was important because it needed to be disseminated into the smaller communities, the rural areas, the farming towns, the places where their children were going to at some point move off of that workforce. I think it was like 1921, the child labor laws were actually passed finally. And so that was like imagine that countdown. And this is the big takeaway here. Like, there's nothing else more. Like, wherever you go, I live in Arizona, so you still see this in action today. You still see it. The mechanized farming methodology. Planting it, so the original patent, the crop rotations, you know, changing it up every so often, putting, you know, corn instead of cotton. Cotton is the one that's depleting it, but cotton was the bigger, You're getting a lot out of that cotton. The original stem. Stem, 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 stem. Stem, 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 stem. Stem, 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 stem. Cotton picking Negroes. What do we do with these cotton picking Negroes? The other one that they always know about is Madam C.J. Walker and the hair products, which is why I made the reference earlier. This is my presentation. They already know about Madam C.J. Walker, so I could just put her picture alone on the board, and they can talk about the hair, they can talk about the makeup, they can talk about the skincare, they can talk about all of that other stuff about the Black woman, Madam C.J. Walker, but I feel like they would not be able to have such an in-depth conversation about Booker T. Washington. They could also talk about Mr. Peanut, George Washington Carver. So the two Black inventors would be Madam C.J. Walker and George Washington Carver, the peanut and hair products. But I'm not so simple. I am not so right there on the surface about hair. I just don't do it, man. I just do not do it. I can have an entire conversation and never talk about hair twice. Well, 3 times, really. And even though these are the prominent of the 1900s to the 1929, everyone would agree it's Madam C.J. Walker and her hair. She needed a business structure, a business network, so to say. She needed connections with the talented 10th, a place to go, someone to speak with. And that coalition required chapters. It required an organized methodology that, a green book per se, of residences, businesses, and places to go and stop when she was selling products. She could become famous and rich, very rich. But it was through this network, this underground network, right? So in 1905, when she finally moved forward with the hair care products, traveled with her husband through the South, giving lectures and demonstrating the Walker method. Educator. What more can I say? That's about it. Oh, and every time I asked people to assist me with this before I started getting bent out of shape, everybody would just tell me, well, just go look for a list of African-American inventors and scientists. Just look for a list of African-American inventors and scientists. So as you know, even Wikipedia brings up the very first one among the earliest was George Washington Carver. Wow, he wanted poor farmers to grow alternative crops, both as a source for their own food and as a source of other products to improve their way of life as business. It didn't become a real viable business model as we saw until like the 1938s, when it was like $200 million in the 1930s. I let that hit somebody across their motherfucking head. $200 million a year. Let it smack them right across their face. $200 million. And that's why we talk about them. Then they go into folks, the super soaker, of course. But yeah, this is what they wanted. It was like, why don't you just get a list and put people on there? I was like, man, could you not be so generic? The folding bed used by the military folks. A lot of the folks who made inventions that went, and having a conversation even with me, I can just start naming some of these folks. The first African-American was it the Benjamin Banneker with the clock or whatever it was? Big Ben. But yeah, this is what they was telling me to do. And I was like, man, get out of here. I like this one though. This is the premise. The premise was in the agrarian South, during this time when they were coming up, what were their motivations? What were they influenced by? How did they become? What is the real significance of their contributions? Why should we celebrate them? It was because they had the ability to turn this into gold. This was the black man's invention that allowed the planting of all of that crop. You're like, well, black people were slaves. They worked on farms. They planted cotton. Yeah, and it was the invention of the African American that allowed them to do so most efficiently. Now, their labor, what they were denied, they were absolutely denied the access to their capital that they were generating through their labor. We know that to be true. Absolutely denied the access to their capital. So they were generating all of these profits, and it wasn't even the most profitable even at those times, because you're still talking about that small model. People didn't have mechanized farming like you see now with all of these rows that are neatly put out there and all of that. It would be small in somebody's backyard or something like that. But it took more than that to get there. These large acres, football fields, where it looks exactly like the football field, except the lines go all the way across the field instead of just hash marks on the outside lines. This football field, when they were walking and they were chalking that field and putting those things in there, they were using Henry Blair's invention or a variation thereof. And they still were using this invention. They still were using it. See, 1860, he was like 5 years old. He would have been somebody who probably could have had to push this damn thing, because the 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, they were not en masse going to school. Less than 4 had that day off. No, they had to do something. Probably when he was like 12 years old, he probably told him to use this. And for the next 4 years, he was like, man, nah, bro, I can't even push that thing. That thing heavy as a motherfucker. But this was the thing that was actually seeding. And so he laid the seeds for education. And I call it STEM. Many people say, well, no, it would be STEAM technically because you're talking about the A being agriculture, if that's what they want to say. But the cultivation of so the agricultural scientist George Washington Carver needed a practical use of all of that chemistry. Yeah, you can have a lab that studies the biomes and all of that, but you're going to have to make this useful. And so his mandate then to actually sell it, at first, him and George Washington Carver couldn't even get along. I tell you like this, Midtown Pookie. I was at a trade show and I was having conversations with a veterinary practice. I was having conversations with doctors from veterinary practices and some of their office managers. They come to this trade show in Las Vegas. I posted some of the pictures on my Instagram. Follow me there if you haven't yet. And while I was there, a representative of the Tuskegee University Veterinary Medicine College, Tuskegee University College of Veterinary Medicine. There it is. She was there and looking to get their funding reinstated as a partner. And she actually gave me the story. Once I found out who she was and where she was from, my job went out the window, and it was now everything to learn about what she knew about Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. And so she just started breaking down the information. She even confirmed, I know you were a part of the stream there on Taz Exclusives channel recently, where he did the story of the Wizard of Oz, and he broke it down in all those different analogies. And I gave him another story like the Wizard of Oz or the Wiz from the view of the African Americans at the time, who were actually there during the industrialization period. And I listed off a few folks. And at that time, the main character, Dorothy, I represented as Mary Bethune Cookman. And at the same time, I was like, in order for her to get to the point of where she was, she had those industrialists that she needed to talk to, or the wicked witch and the good witch of the North, of course. But we said, well, like industrialists like Carnegie and some of those other folks who funded the HBCUs and things, we gave them that, right? Oh, appreciate you. We gave them that information as an analogy that Mary Bethune-Cookman had to go up north, but then we gave her characters as she was getting on down the yellow brick road. And who was she accompanied by? W.E.B. Du Bois was more or less, we called the Scarecrow. It took him all the way into the 1909s and then even thereafter to even get an organization, even with all of that writing and all of that prolific writing. Let me give it to you right now. I was going to put this off, but I'm gonna actually bring it up. He was the Harvard graduate, so he's talking about the talented 10th, Du Bois. He challenged Booker T. Washington on his position about agricultural education, practical education, industrial education, and craftsmanship. He wanted, Booker T. Washington wanted industrialists. He wanted men to run their farms like businesses and create surplus that they could exchange in a market that was self-sufficient in the Black community. It was a segregated society. And so he needed them to understand the mechanics of business and farming and agriculture and mechanics. He had brought in this prolific thinker, this agricultural scientist named George Washington Carver, to drive that home as the head of the Department of Agriculture. Why is that important? Because they are farmers and they are moving into the space of home ownership, and there are lights going on in New York that he has a vision will one day come to the South. And so the Scarecrow is challenging the Tin Man most afraid. He's challenging him on his, if he only had a brain. He's challenging on his position, his perspective, his intelligence. He's saying, what are you advocating for our people? Why are you not advocating politics? And so if this guy, Du Bois, is going to challenge him, then we then, as the opposing party or the Bookerites, then say, well, let's look to what our opposition is saying. And while I was doing that research, it made this conversation that much more rich, because I'm like, I know that there was a classic debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Let's see what that was all about. We look at Du Bois's thesis while he was up there entertaining the white folks at Harvard and see what he actually had to say. Now, this is available at Harvard. And so for Moses, the researcher, I say, don't stop at the cover. The suppression of the African slave trade to the United States of America by W.E.B. Du Bois. And this guy goes in to break down in chapter 2, the planting colonies. And many will not understand the colonization of the South. And so therefore, this chapter would fly right over their head. The significance of the planting colonies would fly right over their head. That in an agricultural society in the South, producing 80% of the United States of America's tax revenue since 1700s, it's only necessary to talk about the 80% revenue generated through agriculture in the South. And those Black men and their descendants, and those descendants of slavery, those children and grandchildren, and then so on into today, what was their actual pathway towards success? It was laid out clear. Chapter 4, the trading colonies. See, we had to take agriculture and mend that with business. These land grant, everything was about grants, right? We grant you this much land. We grant you 400 acres of land. We grant you this much. That was the Homestead Act of 1862. It is the granting of all of these lands. And so he does his thesis on this same topic. Look, these folks were the planting class, or the big planter elite, and they sent their governors who had all of these acres, and they needed all of those acres cultivated. and clear the fields, cultivate them. That was the job and the duty and the labor and the service of the black man. And then in 1854, which is before that Homestead Act, there was that thing that said whether you're free or they are enslaved, they are not citizens. That was that Supreme Court case. And then they go to war and all of this stuff. And now, man, he's looking at it from this lens of business. So chapter 5, the period of the revolutions. He takes them all the way back into that same carnal beast, man to man, mano a mano type sword or bullet or however it is that they got down in those trenches, and talks about the blood that was shed. And then he says, as a measure of reconciliation, there should be a governing or a convening of men who will work out their differences without war. Chapter 6, the Federal Convention. He doesn't stop there because he knows that that convention is excluding other parts of the world at large. Chapter 7, Toussaint L'Ouverture. Now that's one that many of us can just jump right into. So I put the link in the description. If you want to read about revolution or you want to learn about that mind state, I would say chapter 7 of W.E.B. Du Bois's thesis, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America. I would say start right there. See, Du Bois covers all of this history from 1638 to 1870. And why is that important? Because then you would have this movement that is towards education. We have to do something with this Negro. It is the Jim Crow ushered in and the violence of this savage brutality again from chapter 5, but now it is race-based and again aimed directly at black men. Free black men now. And so you have chapter 9, the international status of the slave trade, to make it bigger than a story about black slaves, but to make it an economic endeavor that America is undergoing. And what does he go into in chapter 10? The rise of the Cotton Kingdom. See, this information is free for you, and they will not get all of this because it doesn't fit neatly on a presentation, a PowerPoint slide, or on a, what do you call them? A vision board. But this is everything that's missing when you talk about why is it important that we highlight black men, black pioneers in STEM or in education or whatever their inventions are during Black History Month. Oh, that cotton and the cultivation of cotton being a resource or a nutrient depleting crop that an African-American George Washington Carver said a solution would be to rotate this crop. That's how you get the most profitability out of your land, is when you till it right. The rise of the Cotton Kingdom. Then the final crisis. And he also talks about the essentials and the struggle. Now, we love the final crisis. We know that his actual publication and media ended up becoming or taking on that title of the crisis. Chapter 12, the essentials in the struggle, is where his true deviation or his differentiation from Booker T. Washington comes in. And if you really want to know the crutch of his argument, of his great and classic debate against Booker T. Washington, who is the person who I highlight, I'm more of a Bookerite, is right here in chapter 12. It is the political movement. See, he talked about how the question arose. He talked about the moral movement when they were trying to preach their way out of slavery or bondage, or trying to out-minister the white man. Get in there and give a good sermon, and hopefully they will change how they feel and treat black folks. That was what we did in the struggle. We had our pastors go and give sermons to the big white church. Next up was that political movement. And see, that was the one that Booker T. Washington argued against. He said, man, let's leave politics over there and let's just focus on what we would call today the bag. Then, as you see, it evolved into the economic movement, which is how do you get the best use of the land that you have in order to create a surplus that you may share with others or to create additional profits with? How do you make it practical in the lives of those small Black farmers? There was 9.8 million of them that he was concerned with as advisor to the president and as the leader of a substantial organization at the time of Black businesses, pastors, and academia. All right, man. This gem can be read. I won't sit here and read all of it here for us here today, but the link is in the description. So much information to be omitted, like in 1896. And how did Booker T. Washington respond to Plessy versus Ferguson? See, I told you a little bit earlier about unknown history, Ida B. Wells getting snatched off that train in 88. Or was it 82? Huh? I don't know. I showed you earlier. And most people know about Plessy versus Ferguson, Homer Plessy, which was 1890, where he was snatched off the train. This is a legal battle that was going on at the time that secretly funded and supported by Booker T. Washington. But this legal battle where it was, look, this person is super light-skinned, an octoroon. Let's see if he loses his first-class seat the same way that they treated our sister over in Tennessee. Just like they know about Rosa Parks getting snatched off the bus. Very fair skin. Let's see what happens again. And so you had it where in 1899, this is the next case, right? Cummings versus Board of Education. That was another one that's still trying to challenge segregated public schools. Why? Because in the 1900s, 1 year later, we still were having fewer than 4 Black boys and 4 Black girls able to get that education. And so they challenged it on a legal basis, saying, well, damn, can they go to the white school or not? It's closer. And the answer was still no. And so they could still try to teach, you know, what they could at the church level or the small basements of churches and things, but it was inadequate. They needed actual buildings and structures, which meant they needed funding. And so the creation of this land grant colleges model, or using that was already on the books since the 1860s, the land grant colleges system. It was on the books. And so they were taking advantage of it. And you'll see that it grew all the way up to 78 historically Black colleges, 78. And many of those originating with the intention to create educators, people who could make it practical. But they couldn't move around, and they couldn't send their boys and girls, their sons and daughters, to the other public schools. And so we needed a champion, and we had Booker T. Washington. Man, there's just so much. I think I gave us this. Oh yeah, this is the chart that I recreated, the characteristics of the households in 1900 versus 1990. As we saw as we see here in 1990, they'll show you what careers they had, professions, and all of that shit. The residents, 1900, 90% of blacks had as a region of residence, they still lived in the South. Then the migration happened and all of that, which we know. 75.8% of them were in rural parts of the South. So they weren't even in the cities. And those who were in the more established cities in the South, there were segregated schools that their children couldn't go to. Not in mass. So there was a lot of challenges that we were up against, the different occupational distribution. We see that here, and it includes white, black, and then female and male and all of that. And so I didn't want to go all the way into it. I wanted to keep the presentation streamlined, just including the blacks, but I know they like to have a point of reference sometimes. So, but it just creates more information that's needed. As we see here in the 90s, we're in the 95 percentile of percent of those school age boys and girls attending school now. But it wasn't always as such. What else we got? Yeah, I think that's about as much as I can do at this point. I know somebody else will cover Thurgood Marshall and his contributions. Oh yeah, when they went into George Washington Carver and some of the things that were said about from Booker T. Washington, that was also some critical drama in that whole message. So with that being said, this presentation, if I had one key takeaway, it would be, what do you think about the idea? Since, we can't give them everything, it's just too much information. It's even too much for me to even present. It took 2 hours even here for myself. What about this idea of just making like the little small picture dots like this, and then just plugging in like the Madam C.J. Walkers and the Latimer Lewises and like giving them like an icon picture like that? Who else will we include on these little icon images? And would you include some of the more radical positions like A. Philip Randolph? They can talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma and Black Wall Street. So do you include like a sticker that just says Black Wall Street or Tulsa, Oklahoma, something like that to be a point of reference? That would be my only question, is how much do you actually give them? What do you consider would be triggering, or the information that, it's good in mixed company? Again, this B1 perspective that I'm delivering is a deliberation, right? I have a lot of anxiety about the information that we actually share. And so the information that we actually share, some of this shit ain't for them anyway. And the African Americans who don't already know it, damn, bruh, that's just sad. Is it something that we take the lead on actually deliver to them inside of corporate America? It's a big job. It's definitely a lot of information. There are so many backstories and underlying stories that could be included. It gets heavy. It gets heavy. Like when you talk about this period, there is no way that you wouldn't want to include, especially if you call it with a theme as big as, pioneers in STEM, or the champions of STEM, early STEM, or black STEM, or something like that. Blacks in black inventors. And you would want to capture that with a title. But then once you put that title down there, you're like, damn, I got to include Mary on this bad boy. But it's like, damn, but if I include, do you even tell them about the whole political strategies that they went through? Yeah, like some blacks, they're going to bury that information in the keynotes. They're going to put that information on the note cards. They're going to put it somewhere else. They're not going to include it on the slides. And for the most part, it's probably because we still struggle with the crafting of the narrative. Like, what is it how do you say it, the words? And then how do you really give it to them? And like, if I could talk it, if I had time to be there with everybody and to present it, it took me 2 hours here today. I'm almost at an hour and a half. What would I want to highlight, even as the ambassador of the information? And so for me, I fine tooth comb. Look, I show you just how many slides this thing was of me finding the information, the timeline. Look at that. What I covered here actually goes all the way back to the 1780s or 90s, because that's W.E.B. Du Bois's thesis, right? It goes back into those wars, how the kingdom was established as traitors and all of that shit, not traitors, Traitors. That's where they keep getting it fucked up when he was arguing against Booker T. Washington. They keep making it seem like he was, or that information, traitors, was used in the other term. So the sleight of hand, when they used that bit of English and made it seem like W.E.B. Du Bois was referring to him in the form traitor, Traitor, as someone who is going against his race or his group. And that's where they get the Uncle Tomism or bootstrap. That is a derivative narrative, one that is not supported by the actual information. But at the actual information level, it was Trader, because his thesis was about the establishment of kingdoms and those who were in the business of trade. And he goes into the wars and the revolution of Toussaint Louverture, all of that as an analogy for what Black men have to do. This suppression that W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about was one of that innate spirit to fight back, to resist. And the suppression of that spirit, what did it do to that individual as a human being or as a man? And their conversation was about Black men and what those Black men should and ought to be doing when it comes to education. So education, for one, was the position of, man, it's got to be practical, industrial. What can you actually do? Shoe shine. Are you a mason? Are you a carpenter? Whatever you can do. Now, interesting tidbit why you got to include Mary, because she was the one who opened up the girls' school originally, the school for Negro girls. And she was teaching that home-based, home economics. What do you do to keep a household intact? The division of labor became an argument well later, into like the 1980s, of a feminist movement hijacking of what her feminism actually looked like. Her feminism was one that emphasized what was the role of the Black woman in society at large. Does she have access to services? Does she only have the restricted form of labor on a farm or to her husband? That was a division of labor argument from the feminist perspective at the time, that was then hijacked and meant something along the lines of what can they work and do they get equal pay, all of that other shit. But at first, her curriculum was about what she can do to support the farm, just like his. It was the sewing, the knitting, the what do you do with this cotton, the creating of your own socks and drawers, whatever it was, to getting to the point of having a surplus that you can provide for others in your community, because the vision was to be a self-sustaining, autonomous group of people. It was a segregated South, which meant you had to be self-sustaining. If you weren't self-sustaining, you were going to Dwight's grocery store. If you weren't self-sustaining, you were going to Dwight's home loans and insurance. If you weren't self-sustaining, then you didn't even have bread on your table or meat, chicken in your pot. Her approach towards self-sustainability also meant partnering and forming coalitions with white philanthropists in the North. She is Dorothy going down that yellow brick road. She is going to find the good wizard of the North and has to overcome some other wizards. You feel me? And the Wizard of Oz, no, those other witches, that's what they call them. Salem witch trial, go north. My bad. Keep this in mind, is that this is the research. That this is the research that gets streamlined and put on a board, and people are able to look at the pictures and say, oh yeah, I know about Booker T. Washington, and walk right past because they think they know it already. And I don't got time to say it to them, and I definitely don't have time to give them the passion. I definitely don't have time to write it down, and I don't have the language to make it make sense. It is Black radical thoughts like these that helped these folks navigate the waters that they were in. All right, KH, salute. And so as I study this Reconstruction period, like my brother Bro Rob, and I learn what I can learn, that I can present it on these great challenges, like Black History Month program at your job. What are you going to actually contribute? It is like, well, damn, this is, a Fortune 200 company here, And your contribution to Black History Month is one that can make or break those same perceptions that you say exist inside of corporate America. You feel me? And you being the person who actually does give a fuck, not the Uncle Tom, as I put my air quotes on, you have a duty and a responsibility to inform them. And you can't just say, this is too hard. I was having literal panic attacks because I'm like, how do I get this information streamlined? And then that doubt starts to rise up, Midtown. That doubt starts to rise up that says, damn, they're not even going to read it if I put all of this together. That doubt that rises up that says, man, what is this for? At the end of the day, they just going to walk by this presentation and say, that looks very good. That they are looking for the visual appeal. That's what they're grading it on. And then they're going to walk past it. And see, as a member who works in that organization, and I know that there will be some who come after me, I have to keep that in the back of my mind as a challenge that presses me forward. And thus I created these cards that I will cut out and put on the board. And like the others, I will hide the information in plain sight for those who want it. And they will be able to, if they have the gall to flip open or to hit the link in the description, they will have that information available if they just pull it forward and look at the next information card underneath the one that they see with the pretty picture on it. But they got to be willing to look past the picture and this information will be available for them. Yes, it is streamlined and it is going to miss a hell of a lot of this context, but it gets about as close as we can expect it to get. I've told them before, Brother Moses, I am a YouTube media developer. This content has been putting together a actual board presentation. The anxiety that I expressed, I had to get out here, but putting together a board presentation for Black History Month. It's excellent. As you see, this is all the information that had to be consolidated. We give them some little stickers that we cut out and put on the board and tape or paste on there. We tell them what it's for because we're requesting funding. It's a Fortune 500. It is in the finance space. And we provide the funding programs for veterinary practices. I was at a trade show and I found out from there that the Tuskegee Institute, which is the veterinary college there from Tuskegee, after all of this legacy, their funding had been canceled. And so I'm going to ask these folks, these white folks here, excuse me, they are still the white folks, but I am going to ask them to reinstate funding for Tuskegee Veterinary College because I'm still B1, bro, even in corporate America. And now, while I can't give them all of this information about the court cases, it will be on the board. I can't force them to read it, but I'll put it on the board in the background. But the bigger slide is, or the more streamlined slide will look like this. Well, I don't have it, but the streamlined slide, oops, damn it. Where'd it go? This one, animations, animation slideshow from this one. So I'm a timeline strip, my purpose statement. He was there for the development of the industrial Black man. And then he will have his big picture there. It will be about Tuskegee University, the College of Veterinary Medicine. As we see, that was in 1938, the school that was actually erected. But it's about legacy of an organizer and a fundraiser. Have some pictures there. This is what's going on the board. And then we'll see there where he has a big picture of him. If they want his story, and then underneath where it says his story, you will find those slips of paper that include his story, right? And if they walk up and if they're so bold to turn the page, then they'll be able to get his story. Put it in chronological order on the left there, and then back to the top. These slips be cut out. And so on the right side, going down again, is some more of his story, even when he brought in the head of agriculture department, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver. That's the guy. Give him some more stickers to put on the side of the board. Give him the why, was it important? Give him the data, and then show that he was an originator in STEM education. In this classroom, this was Booker T. George Washington Carver right here. He was actually the dean. And so they finally did get all of those beakers and glasses and things that they needed to run a full science lab. But until they got funding for all of these beakers and bottles and vials, and until he was able to actually generate enough money through the businesses and through the business model, they didn't have all of this. They couldn't even do science experiments and things like that to be able to teach folks about soil and to get the products out into the market that helped with, the more profitable business models. And so they were still relying upon just that cotton and just that corn. And then he finally got the peanut out there and said, look, the peanut creates, PB&J that we know today, or peanut butter. So anyway, whole lot of information. Hopefully it was somewhat beneficial to someone. Maybe it was beneficial to you. And if so, I just ask that you hit that like button. Would definitely appreciate that. All right, who we got in the chat? Let me go on and check that out. Quite a few folks came in and rocked with me here today. Midtown, of course. Bro Rob, I saw a little bit earlier. GBS always rocking with the kid. Thank you so much, and I appreciate that. Hopefully this information was a link as we move from the 1860s and this story of reparations and these reparations claims. And we continue to build out these cases. Look, there were a lot of different communities, not just the Black Wall Street, where we can see the fullest potential and the fullest development of an industrial Black man, but those other conglomerates and co-ops that existed where folks were forced out, where those banks were the ones, when they said redlining, these were the folks who were actually absolutely denied. They weren't approved at all. If you even tried to find it, they tell you, look, we don't keep records of those we decline for. And that would be a lie. They keep the records for a little minimum period of time of at least 7 years of folks that apply. Now, I don't know when that standard came in, but I'll tell you this, the redlining model was still there that said folks in these regions or these territories, these zip codes, these areas of the city shall not receive. Those who are in this one shall receive. These were the folks who had to grow through all of that after this generation passes. So there we got it, or not even passes, after this generation moves into the next generation of sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters. Big old Bentley facts. So it's about the education and housing for, at this point, it was around 9.8 to all the way up to like 10 million Black farmers. And they were able to do so. The education had an emphasis on agricultural research. Why? Because more than 60% of them were still working on the farm or as farm labor. I ought to contemporize this, but I don't want to mess up the stream with a little bit of more conjecture. I think we've given just enough history to keep this thing popping and to say that is a good point for a close. But I do got 5 minutes, so let me go on and drop this. I got 5 minutes. With the last 5 minutes, what would I want to cover? Let's see here. What do we got? Yeah, that would be a good one. What else we got? I don't know what I should do with these last 5. How about I do this? Hop on over here where it's my guy, O'Shea Duke Jackson, the Negro Manosphere, dropped this video that I thought was extremely good. I actually like it. Many Black women don't understand Black men, a certain perspective that you can get on the Negro Manosphere. It's typically going to be guys having conversations about what guys are going through. This one, on the same sense, kind of projects into women not understanding. I think it was a phenomenal build that he has available on Patreon. I would say check it out. What else would I do in my last 5 minutes besides market for some of those other folks who I rock with? Let me see. This one's a good one, right? And so I struggle going back and forth here. I actually have the College of Veterinary Medicine. I wanted to actually print this out, but it was just too much ink. And then they also have one on the Tuskegee Institute website to actually show them the impact. which was the College of Veterinary Medicine. I just zoomed in from Google Earth to find it. But they also have the hospital. You know, they have a lot here that they've grown and expanded themselves out to be. So definitely proud of the university for their growth and expansion over all of these years. Booker T. Washington is a known name now. It's out there. But for our sake, this little bitty born in a basement house outside of the Tallahassee River or Tallapoosa River, East Tallahassee. Let me keep zooming out on the way towards Montgomery, Alabama, and hey, so much more. As you see here on the screen, we're still zooming out here. Tallahassee, you got Tampa, you got Louisiana, you got Mississippi. Zoom out on the world, because all of this was the impact that he would have to have. Once you get this way, you finally get to Shreveport, Arkansas, if you continue to keep running to the west. Daytona Beach, which is not Madam C.J. Walker, but Mary Bethune-Cookman, that she built her way out here. He was way over here. Then you get to Alabama. You know, the HBCUs are all scattered in this area here. But let's keep shooting now. Because it expanded all the way out to Texas, as we've seen. The University of Chicago still houses a lot of the information that we need. Well, Virginia, this was the rich territory to where he was, trying to work on these long fields. Would have had a long way to go to get to where he actually did his work, but it would have been way up here in the New York sectors, Pennsylvania and all of that. So a big world that he had to navigate. And I'm going to end it. Oh, shoot. Damn. I just got to that last section. But zooming in on the map here, what you have here is Sherman's Reservation. So during this same time was 1860s. And all of this land that you see here that comes through here from Charleston all the way up to like Jacksonville, St. Augustine, all of this was considered Sherman's Reservation. And this was the land that was originally allotted by General Sherman in 1862, that same time period, and was supposed to have been the place. That was supposed to have been, you know, what Moses would say, the promised land, and it was denied. And so if there is anything that I can say in hindsight as I look back, both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington missed the opportunity to advocate for reparations right here in this time space. Neither wanted to aggravate that Southern, and neither they knew that that would be a polarizing thing to reach for when having conversations with white philanthropists. So both of them avoided it. One didn't have the brains to articulate it, and the other just didn't have the heart to say it. But what happened to that promised land that was promised to us? And so what you see on your screen there on the left side of this major highway here, the 95, this left side is what was considered the Sherman Reservation, and all of that land that was for African Americans. Still there. Still something of question. We know in 1862, they did the Confiscation Act of land and all of that. So it is something that legislation can happen. I don't advocate that we wait around and wait for that legislation to happen. I do know we still have work to do on the other ends in our entrepreneurial endeavors, in our education and learning what we can and using those skills to create a surplus through our labor, whether we want to sell it as service or whether we want to create products that we can actually sell. So that's definitely breaking down the information for us all the way in 100 360 degree or 360 degree view. 180 degrees is how I turn this map. For some people, they would only understand this world if we rotated it back this way for them. You're like, oh, Florida is down there. This is the way that they can understand the map. But I understand it otherwise. I understand it from the lens of the South and the North. And I mean, we can do it this way. It makes the same difference for those who need that. For me, I got to turn it on its head to see what the actual development looks like. And the development is rich. The carving out of these lands, these land grants, as you see them into their grid squares, and the ability to turn those grid squares into profit. That model is what we still see across America. It's the standard of development, the cultivating them, not just into the acreage or how they were broken down, but then even the designation of these acres and who owns this square, under which name do these squares fall under, or these rectangles fall under. And so I can look like a concrete jungle. It didn't always look like this. While today you can have schools within every 5 miles, it didn't always look like this. These were some cold and some long highways to walk along, and many of them were not paved yet. But this is that distribution of land, what land grants actually look like when they're granted lands or parcels of land, how that breaks down on a map, how they kind of grid lock it out and say this is yours versus this is yours. And there's just so much that you can take from that reparations conversation, even as you look at this world that has been mapped out and designed to say, well, what does 40 acres actually look like? And this is the best estimate that I would give anyone of when I say what the 40 acres and a mule argument looks like to me is the development of probably 2-story houses, some like this. This is how it's actually structured once it's fully developed and the most profitable use of therein. You see that? Now this is a co-op. Now this is a bank, a Freedman's Bank. Yeah, I can scroll that beautiful beam footage for you again. All right, that's my alarm clock. That's all I got, and I'm out.